as in true fashion and continue the methodologies that you actually saw happen right in front of your eyes. These panelists actually have not seen the questions.
The last ones couldn't remember, so it didn't matter.
So, and Keith, who's actually second from your left, as you can see in the agenda, he's not actually in the agenda. We actually asked him to join the panel this morning because of his background. He actually is on the panel without really understanding what this is about. But he actually has plenty of experience to share, so we're going to actually go try to get some of his wisdom. Okay? So what are we actually talking about here? Todd already actually alluded to this morning. There is a huge amount of pressure to deploy new energy technologies at scale. And you can argue whether some of these technologies like pyrolysis or RNGs are actually new technology, but I certainly is a new application. And depending on who you talk to, you're going to see this conversation about the valley of death. Okay? And it's pretty self-evident, but it says at the beginning there is R&D resources that are going to get depleted as it becomes more and more toward the commercialization and into the public sector, to the private sector, whereas the research for commercialization actually goes up. And when those two some of those two are not enough, that's when the valley of death actually occurs. According to the recent estimate, about 90% of the startups fail, which value that is about $3 trillion, okay? So it's not a small amount. And as Todd actually alluded to it this morning, a lot of companies, however, are relying on modular standard design approaches to try to roll this out. And you can actually find numerous of these on the internet. It's more, if you actually look at the World Economic Forum, they say the SMRs are going to leverage standard mass manufacturing production, Synergy, Sunfire, all these companies are out there saying, as long as we actually have a standard product, we should be able to deploy them and scale. Okay? Now, we actually have a panelist here who's actually living through that or have worked with many companies that actually have done that, that realizes it's not just a simple deployment of products. Reality is a little bit more complicated, and demand, local requirements, conditions of each site requires configure-to-order installation. To talk about that, we actually have 4 panelists here. As you can see, Jim is from Jim.
We got 2 Jims.
One.
We actually have
I just raised my hand.
3 Jameses on stage, so we'll refer to them Jim 1, Jim 2, Jim 3. Jim Craig is currently the Vice President of Project Management Execution for Brightmark at Chevron, where he's leading the project development delivery team focused on delivering portfolio of dairy RNG facilities around the United States. He's been with Chevron for the past 20 years, but what he's mostly famously known for is when we were first working on one of the largest projects that Gary already talked about. Todd and I were actually doing a presentation of how PPM can be applied. He said during the break, are you guys talkers or doers?
I don't think it was the break. I think it was in front of the whole crowd.
It was.
And I think at that point, we actually shut down the presentation and went to work. That was the beginning of implementation. So that's what Jim is known for. Keith, again, thank you, Keith, for actually joining the group. Has worked for BP over 18 years, working in major capital projects globally. He has led major capital oil and gas projects in the North Sea, Egypt, and Angola. As part of BP's transition to an integrated energy company, Keith was tasked with leading the green hydrogen project, helping the company make the bold move and helping establish green hydrogen as a viable energy source. So he's actually living that experience. Jim Richardson, with Heirloom Carbon, is the interim head of capital projects at Heirloom Carbon, a direct air capture company based in Brisbane, California. Heirloom operates the first U.S. DAC facility in Tracy and has plans to do more in Shreveport, Louisiana, potential plans in Texas, Oklahoma, Europe, Canada, and Middle East. The Jim actually has over 30 years in the related to capital projects business. If you actually haven't met Jim, when I first met him, he actually had a license plate on his car called To Gallus. And if you actually know this Scottish slang, it actually means someone's bold or daring. If you think anyone's going to try something that's bold, talk to Jim. and Todd, who requires no introduction because you already actually heard him talk. So, the questions. Well, let's actually start from the external to internal. Okay? The external wise, everyone here actually has many decades of experience in large capital projects. How are the market expectations different from what you're used to seeing, and how does that drive your execution strategy? Jim Richardson, start with that.
Yeah, talk a little to that. When we think of market expectations, I'm maybe touching on a couple of angles, and you can redirect. One is customer, the market. What's the customer's expectations? And so, in the CO2 market for capture of carbon, the market is very preliminary. It's a voluntary market. So you have buyers who are doing this because they understand the direction. They possibly expect that a mandatory market will emerge. But you have a market that is customers willing to lean in and willing to pay arguably what one would believe is above market price for low early volumes to start the industry. And then the other part of a touch-on market is the investment. The investors and which investors will come to the table. And we touched earlier in one of the presentations on investment in the Valley here in particular, very much comfortable with digital investment, bits and bytes, less comfortable when it comes to major capital projects. Building steel's not a traditional investment for VCs. And so the market there, we'll probably get into this more. Where do you get the money? How do you fund both the technology, the innovation development, and then the delivery of major projects for very willing customers at the back end?
Jim, anything you want to add?
Anything I want to add? I'm just thinking through what the question was, to be honest with you. I guess, just thinking about the structure of the projects out there and the financing that comes in, really the external piece of it. And what I've seen, because I've been kind of thrown into a joint venture called Brightmark and doing renewable natural gas. And, you're always looking for money to fund these things. And I'm trying to touch a little bit on a hydrogen project that we've kind of bought into. And when you start looking at the external stakeholders, and you talk about external stakeholders to fund it, and you got people trying to execute. So the external stakeholders are wanting certainty, right? So they want lump sum EPC contracts with liquidated damages, and think that's going to give them price certainty or guarantee that they're going to have to pay more money. You got very complex structures. You have engineering company, you have owner companies like a Chevron, partnering with an equipment supplier. Then you have DOE funding, and then you got 7 companies of joint ventures or capital raising over here. So it's very complex from the capital standpoint. And then all of a sudden you're ending up with a contract you got to go execute with new people, new companies that really are not that sure how to go execute or how the work gets done, that you have lump sum EPC contracts with. And so it causes external stakeholder management becomes extremely difficult, because if there's any changes, you have a lot of people you have to go engage to get buy-in to these changes that really don't understand projects and how they get done. And then you have contractors at local site conditions that you have local workforce that is not as, maybe the capability is not as strong as somewhere in the Gulf Coast, where they really know how to get work done. You're in these really remote areas and you're relying on a very transient workforce. And then they're not the most disciplined either. So you end up with a little bit of a conflict of how you're going to go execute these projects predictably and competitively and manage that cost. It becomes extremely difficult. And I've spent a lot of time, especially in my last thing of renewable natural gas, sitting at dairy farms, right? I mean, I've been across all the Midwest, which is absolutely beautiful, and I've been feel very lucky that I've been able to experience it. But it's extremely hard to execute in those areas with the type of contract structures that we have out there. And a lot of that is driven by the external stakeholders out there thinking they're going to get certainty with the type of contract structure they put in. But at the end of the day, The contracts are beyond schedule, they are over budget, and at the end of the day, the workforce, the owner company that's out there, the new company that may be a JV or whatever it is, and the small EPC that really doesn't do any work, they subcontract it all out, don't understand the workflow and how to get the work done, which causes a lot of variability and a lot of waste cost.
Keith, is that similar to what you're saying, or is there something else that you actually want to touch on?
Yeah, I think oil and gas is pretty straightforward. You know, you produce a barrel of oil, you can definitely sell it. You know where you're selling it to. When you look at green hydrogen projects, the industry, you know, the market's not there. It's, you know, we're trying to establish what the market is, but it actually leads to difficulties with what are you trying to design for? You don't know who your customers are. You don't know what the customer's needs are. You're trying to make decisions up front about, you know, design and plant design, and actually you don't know if it's right or wrong. So when you actually look at the technical aspects of a green hydrogen project, it's pretty straightforward. It's water in, electricity in, mix them together, hydrogen out, oxygen out, and lots of heat. It's kind of it, right? So where the project processes that are set up at the minute, you know, that are deep rooted in oil and gas, they're all about, you know, highly technically complex projects and spend. We're actually trying to apply those processes to, you know, technically straightforward projects is wrong, right? You know, the complexity in green hydrogen projects is about the commercial aspects, and actually it's very dynamic commercially. You know, both from whether it's government funding, who's your off-taker is going to be, it changes all the time, and that changes what your project's going to be. So actually, you know, you really need to think differently about how you want to manage your projects. How much money do you want to spend up front, you know, when you're actually still in that kind of commercially complex area about trying to sign your off-takers. And then once you get to FID, you know, for me, you should try and minimize everything up front, pre-FID. And then once you actually get to a point where you think you're going to sanction your project, that's when you ramp up and you got to go. It's very different to oil and gas.
Yeah. So we actually heard from those that actually have been in a large oil and gas companies or still are in large oil and gas companies trying to actually get into this new energy business. Todd, you actually have been working with a lot of companies that's actually being in the startup phases of these new energy projects. Are you seeing something that's uniquely there, or something that they're trying to do that's gives you a lot of warning signals?
Yeah, so I think if we look at this, and I think it's been alluded to, it's this need to create a customer in demand, secure financing, and then build the production system simultaneously. And I guess it could be 2 chickens and an egg, I don't know. But these 3 factors are in play. What we're seeing, and we're involved in several of these, is truly a lack of understanding of what it takes to do it right, and the amount of funding that's needed to do it at all. One that we're working with, you know, they thought they needed to raise $20 million. We said, well, you really need to raise between 300 and 500 million. Then when we ran the numbers out, it was about 100 billion. Now, where are you going to go get 100 billion to deploy this thing? And 100 billion sounds crazy, but you know, if over 10 years they do 10 billion a year, that's probably the number, right? So people come up with wonderful ideas, proven technology, but they just can't grasp the magnitude of what it is they've created in these new energy technologies. We see that the bigger players are stepping back across the board. BP and Shell have been very, very vocal about that. So you're losing a huge funding source with people that actually have a huge appetite for risk compared to your local banker, let's say, right? So one, where's the capital going to come from, and the amount of capital that's needed to make these things happen? And then I think the second part is trying to get these newcos, if you will, to understand the need to establish a playbook, right? So they say, well, if we went and we had 100 million, what would you go do? I said, well, the first thing we did is we spent 20 million just building the playbook of how we would go do it, and then have the systems all ready to go. Because one of the things that we see is, we get back to what I was talking about earlier, is with the spreadsheets and the expediting and all that. And when you get into that doom loop, it's over, right? So I think there's lack of appreciation of the amount of resources that are needed to create the playbook, to put the commercial agreements in place and then to properly build out the technology. And people just after a while, they don't look at it that way. Things get discombobulated and they tap out. And I think that's what you're seeing going now. So it'll be interesting from a market perspective as the big guys pull back, which is just really unfortunate because they have the know-how and the resources, and the new co guys come in who are all excited, and it's going to be super amazing how this might go.
So I find that very interesting because what I've seen a little bit of is as the energy transition market has evolved, right? It all started with solar and wind, right? Pretty standard product, pretty easy to deploy once you get it out there. But these same players are now going and moving into renewable natural gas. They're moving into hydrogen. And what I've seen a little bit is that they're using that standard playbook they used here for a very simple process and very simple design and installation, taking it and trying to apply it to more complex facilities as they go on. And sometimes it just doesn't work, either from a workflow perspective or from a production system system. It doesn't work, and they need to rethink what they're doing as they apply it to these new systems.
Yeah, just to add a little bit more to that, one of the things that we also see is they're very enamored with the technology element. So with one of the particular ones, they were very much focused on this reactor technology they have. And we said, but the reactor needs a condenser and the rest, then you got a little thing, but that actually isn't the plant. You need a number of reactors and condensers, and then the manifold and all that goes with it, and the power and the rest. That forms the plant, but the plant isn't really a production system because somehow you got to bring in the feedstock, and then you got to do something with the offtake. We don't know who's taking the offtake. You can make multiple products of who might take that, as Keith's alluding to. What actually is the feedstock, and where are we going to process the feedstock, to what extent? So that's going to take us up to the value chain. What the hell are we doing here, right? And they're just down here saying, I got a reactor. And we're going, that's great. You got a reactor. That's super amazing. But you got to go all the way up to the value chain to figure out who's the customer, who's the provider, and then bring that all the way back down. But the reactor is just one little element. And I think that's why they don't understand the amount of capital that's required, because we just got to make some reactors. And so I'll just leave it. I went on a tour of this plant thing to work on. The guy said, yeah, you can't believe it. We had to run the electrical from there all the way over to there. I said, yeah. So that's the plant we're talking about. All right.
I think if I can pick up on that a little bit, Todd, that's one of the things, and I've been incredibly inspired and motivated by the talent that exists in heirloom carbon. We talked earlier about the dilemma and the challenge, and Dave and Will and others talked about the dilemma and challenge of converting your workforce, changing the workforce, and change management. When you're able to work in a company where the workforce is younger, there's not a layer to peel back. There's an opportunity to grow into the right space from day one. And so that's a fantastic opportunity. You're still living in an ecosystem where the providers operate under traditional practices. And so you're a new and youthful owner trying to make that difference. The other thing, and it may be common for others in this space, the cost of the technology may be 20 or 30% of the facility that's required to deliver the end product. And so the need to bring, you can do a cost down on technology. Silicon Valley talks about that a lot, cost down on technology. But when 70% or 80% of your cost is traditional construction or traditional project or steel, then you've got to also have a process which will continually drive that cost down as well. Dave talked to this a little bit earlier. The only process I've seen that does that is a production management system. Continually take the cost out of the majority of the cost of the facility while taking the cost of the technology down simultaneously.
I think that's a great point. Because when you when you go back to the oil and gas bit, and Gary, I think you mentioned this, we're a bit dumb, fat, and happy, right? with the oil price is going to save you, right? When you actually have massive cost overruns. When you're on ultra low margin, like projects like green hydrogen, you don't have that luxury, right? So it's an absolute rigorous focus on cost, and cost out is the only way you're going to get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that it's a whole different mindset that people have to get into, that if you're going to work in that area and in that industry, you've definitely got to have that at the forefront of your, like every decision you're making. The projects that I was working on, I said there was no change. It's like fully off the shelf, right? You know, I just want standard products, and I signed off zero, like zero change orders. And by the time I finished, it's like, you know, I started off with a car and I ended up with a boat, but they told me it was like, you know, it was the same thing, right? You know, it's just not, right? And that's why the costs have, you know, kind of gone astronomical. The schedules have gone out. And it's because people were just back into blindly following process, not thinking about cost.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That actually brings up a very, very interesting point. So one of the things that mostly in the oil and gas, and anyone that's actually a producer environment, like data centers, hospitals, in a producer environment, schedule always trumps cost, right? The sooner you can actually put it online, it's going to actually create the revenue and so forth. But one of the things that we keep hearing from the energy transition or new renewable technology projects is it's got to be commercially viable per project. If not, we're going to shut this down. If so, we're going to move on to the second project. So the methodologies that you used to actually see in the schedule-driven perspective, how does that actually affect how you actually deliver and manage the cost-driven projects? Anyone want to take that first?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
Then you can chuckle. I think one of the things is a really good point, James. So you talk about what you're doing, you're scaling, and ultimately, for the things we're talking about, we're hyperscaling. We're going from, you know, lab scale to trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars. And go read any article about the amount that energy transition and climate change are going to take to be delivered. That is a phenomenal step to make. And meanwhile, earlier this year at McKinsey's hyperscaling conference in San Francisco, Todd and I were there, and James was there. Part of the discussion by the conventional banking institutes was, we've lost that DNA. We don't know how to fund capital steel investments and innovative investments. And so now you're starting to talk about a different ecosystem of funding to take you from that which a VC will fund, which is the pure research, with a willing customer willing to pay for the product at the end and willing to pay sizable portions to get this thing off the ground and into the industry. But you still have to fund a project in the middle. And who are the financiers of that project, and what are the returns expectations? And banks, bless them, I find it difficult to lean in for less than 15 or 20%. And you got to ask yourself, we just gone from lab scale, we maybe got a pilot scale, we're doing a demo scale, but we're not at full commercial scale yet. We're not able to have the scale that actually delivers the economies you need. So how do we go through and how do we transition through that funding step? And I think someone mentioned the valley of death, and those of you who've led Jeffrey Moore and Crossing the Chasm, talking about more of the bits and bytes technologies and technology innovation. I think rather than valley of death, it's really valleys of death. So because you succeeded at lab scale doesn't mean you succeeded at pilot scale. You still got to fund the next scale up. And you'll probably be 3 or 4 projects in before you truly have the economy of scale that drives a repeatable performing business. And that's a tough one for a lot of investors to get over. You're talking about probably being $1 billion in before you're really on that smooth running platform.
I think, James, the, you know, schedule versus, what was it? Cost. There's always a drive to go fast, right? But you have to be real, right? And when you're looking at the green hydrogen market, the technology is not there to go at gigascale. You know, we were at 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, which is actually massive. I think the biggest plant that's currently in operation that's not running at full capacity is 200 megawatts. And I was doing 2 times 200 megawatts and 3 times 100 megawatts all in parallel. So, you know, and they were talking about gigascale, you know, at, you know, before 2030 startup. When you actually take a step back and you look at how would you make a gigascale project, the biggest electrolyzer on the market is 15 megawatts, right? You're going to need like hundreds of these things, right? You know, and even taking a 100 megawatt plant and instead of using a 20 megawatt, right? You know, electrolyzer, I had to use 5 megawatts. And suddenly, the cabling, the pipe rack, and everything just exploded. I needed another building, I needed more HVAC, I needed more cooling just to try and make it work. And that's because the technology's not there. So when you start looking at massive projects and the massive scale up that you're talking about, you're going to have to develop the projects, taking a bit of a risk on technology, that when I get to 2029 or whenever I need to buy the electrolyzers to go make that work, that there'll be something that's 100 megawatts. It won't be 5, right? Now you go and try and push that through a big company, right? These processes are, technology readiness levels and serial number 1 risks and stuff. It's like you're going to talk a different language to people, right? When you're trying to get approvals to go through, you're going, yeah, it doesn't exist, but trust me, it'll get there. It's just a different argument. But if you don't do it, you definitely can't build it out with the technology that's there today.
It's an interesting dilemma in my mind, because a lot of the projects I've been on, I'm on the back end side, right, trying to fix them from disaster. And so you have to step back and look at a lens from 5 years ago, policy drives a lot of these. Timing of policy is what you have to meet, right? And you got to think about what are you trying to produce at what rate. And I think a lot of times we throw that out and just say, hey, we're going to put all these up at one time, give it to a small contractor. We're going to give you a $100 million contract to go build 7 facilities in the middle of Iowa, and you can go do it, and you've never done it before. So it's kind of more of a hope strategy. So I think as owner companies and companies get into this, you got to be very intentional to think about what are you trying to achieve by what time, right? Because I hear the technology's not there, and a lot of times it's not, and you have to lean forward. But the small deployments and understanding what the local conditions are, what the local workforce is to be able to be predictable, I think is a huge step in the right direction as we go through this kind of energy transition piece. And I think there's got to be a lot of education that goes on. I think the owner companies got to be educated on what they're trying to take on. The new energy companies need to be educated on the EPCs need to be, what's going on, because right now what we're doing is not working, in my opinion. The contract structures and the expectations we're setting up out there, to me, is taking us back to era 2 type of execution, which is kind of a hope strategy at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you want anything to add, or?
No.
Okay. So one of the other,
You can't pass. You can pass all you want, Todd.
one of the things that Todd also actually talked about is the playbook. And as you guys all know, any type of project that has multiple organizations actually are amalgamation of the production system that they bring. Whatever the internal processes that they use, or they actually learn how to do their work. One of the things that, just talking to all of you at different times, what's really interesting is, at least in the traditional oil and gas, even the language that you use, FEL, FEED, those are common languages. That's really not common in the architectural engineering construction business, right? Whereas the architectural engineering construction business, you might be more actually conceptual, schematics, and so forth. At the same time, the supply chain that you're working with on these projects actually are bringing people from all sorts of different industries. What recommendation do you actually have for people that are building these playbooks, or what are you doing to build these playbooks in your organizations?
I guess I wish I'd had the time to build a playbook, because I think I went into the Grand Canyon of death, right? with the stuff
Boring
I was on. But yeah, like taking a step back, actually thinking your way through, right? And the question I ended up asking that I've never asked before in any project was, how do I make money? Right? What's the value, what's the sources of value that I'm having to look at? And it certainly wasn't what I thought it was going to be, right? When you're dealing, say, with commercially complicated, very dynamic commercial projects, really having to understand where's your funding coming from, what are they wanting, right? What's their impact on it? Where are you trying to sell it to? What subsidies are you getting? Because if you're building your business on subsidies, it's a really difficult space to be in, right? And most green hydrogen projects, they're all heavily subsidized. It's the only way you're actually going to make money, because nobody in their right mind as a consumer is going to buy green hydrogen over grey when it costs 5 times the amount. So it has to be heavily subsidized at the minute, but you need to understand what those subsidies are, what's the restrictions with them. You know, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, we need to go to China and start bringing in loads of electrolyzers from China because they're cheaper and better. Well, guess what? You can't, right? Because if you're getting European Union subsidies, it's got to be built in Europe, right? If you're going to have like subsidies from the IRA, it's got to be built in America, right? So it's just really complicated commercially. Like I say, technically it's simple, but if you have to understand your value proposition and how you make money.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I'm going to just repeat myself again. You know, one, you don't have time to make playbooks because you got to get out there and deploy, right? I mean, luckily within Chevron, we have baked in operations science as part of our capital projects operating model. So our terminology has kind of changed the way we talk about projects. We do talk about WIP. We do talk about, you know, work in process. We do talk about capacity and how are we going to, you know, optimize these projects and workflows. But when you're going into a new company, they don't understand that language. And so while you have all these complexities that you're trying to do from a commercial standpoint, at the end of the day, you got to deliver a project. And you got to deliver it predictably, and you got to do it within the cost that's associated with it. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how many subsidies you get, you're definitely not going to make any money. And so then you're trying to influence partners and companies outside of you, which is extremely difficult to do. So relationship building, and I think Dave said going through to the work sites and going to the contractor's office. And to me, it's been very much a very interesting dynamic because I'm a very much in your office type of person to build a relationship. That's how I do things. But working with some of these new companies, they don't do it that way. The younger generation, and some of it, we've lost a knack of being face-to-face and actually understanding the work through COVID because people have gotten very comfortable staying at home and doing on a Zoom call or Teams call. And I guarantee you, they call me the grumpy old man who gets on the Teams call and makes everyone turn their camera on, and then I got a whiteboard behind me and I'm writing down actions and telling people what they need to go do. And then pulling people together in meeting rooms because it feels like I'm kind of on a little rant here. Sorry, I'm on my thing, but it just feels like we've lost the art of building relationships, understanding how the work gets done, going to the work phase, talking to the guys that get the work done so we can actually get it done in an efficient manner. And so these projects are complex from the highest part to how they make money. They're equally as complex because we're executing in areas of oil and gas standards or energy standards in the rural parts of the U.S. where you don't have a strong workforce that you're trying to build up as you're building these projects. So you have quality issues, reliability issues. I mean, I never knew that Iowa got down to minus 40 degrees in the winter. I mean, I worked in Kazakhstan. I'm like, man, that is like the Kazakhstan of the U.S. But that's the type of weather extremes you have here in the U.S. And that's where we're trying to build facilities in the middle of dairy farms where the dairy is relying on you to be operable and I'm relying on him to be operable. And it just adds more complexities. So I'll stop. But to say that, I mean, that's complex. This is complex. And at the end of the day, there's got to be a lot of working about what's the workflow and how we're going to get these projects done.
Yeah, I just add one thing, and I'm just sitting here and thinking as I listen to this, is the financial pro forma the new CPM schedule. And so what we see as investors come in, especially guys from the Valley here and the PE guys up in San Francisco and London and so on and so forth, they have these requirements that actually set the project process, right? And with a few of these guys that we know fairly well, they're doing crazy things with the delivery process that it doesn't make sense. So we got to do a proof of concept, and then we're going to do another proof of concept. Well, we already did a proof of concept. Yeah, we got to do some more because we're trying to de-risk, and we get some more money. I'm like, look, the thing's producing. We got to go spend like $1 billion now, or we got to shut it down. There's no in between. I think that's what you're saying. Even if you modularize it, the customer is going to say, don't waste my time. If you can't give me the product, don't waste my time. So, but the financial guys who need to be involved in this, have a different view on don't waste my money, right? And so, it's very complex between the customer that wants a commitment and is serious about committing, but needs to commit at scale, the offtake or the feedstock provider who's probably cool with whatever, but the financial person's putting process, it's almost like having the environmental impact and that stuff influence process, or it is a banker influencing process, and it's a process that's antagonistic to how the project wants to flow and how it wants to be delivered, right? I mean, one of these guys, the banker said we should buy all the stuff in advance. I'm like, why the hell would you do that? And it's because the private equity guy was going to get fees off the money that they put in the organization. I said, but it's going to be dead. And they, well, we may not care because all we care about is the AUM, assets under management. And we're getting 2%, right? I mean, it's
skewed. It's skewed. Yeah, if I could pick up on the playbook comment as well, I think I'm fortunate to be joined by almost a dozen colleagues here from Heirloom, and we're in the middle of trying to write that playbook. And every time we peel back another layer, we get to, oh, there's something else we need to do. And we're still learning how to do workflows, and we're still learning how to put those together. And we're still learning that, to Todd's point, banker expectations do not align with the best flow for the project. But if you're not self-funding and you got to go out for money, you got to try and make those things match somehow. The other thing, we talked about playbooks, and we talked about the slightly different worlds of AEC and EPC, or commercial build and industrial build. And the nature of the technology that we use combines those two. And so you're merging two worlds that have slightly different vernaculars and perspectives of what the flow and process looks like. So we're in the process of having to define our way of working, our definitions, leverage the best of the things that all of you have experienced, such that we can have a team roll forward and be a sustainable production system. So plants as products, projects as production systems. Combine those two factors, allow the process to influence the product, and vice versa. And that's the playbook to build. It's the opportunity. I think if you were to say the macro opportunity is to be able to get that in front of sometimes government officials, sometimes bankers, and have them understand that their, if you like, EPC fixation and project management fixation and stage gate fixation is actually detrimental to outcomes. Yeah. That's a somewhat tough journey. We're on it with part of the Department of Energy in one of our projects. We need to be on it with our funding partners as well. But I'm sure it's a challenge that everyone who's trying to scale comes across.
Thank you. Anyone add anything else? Okay, good. So, as you guys probably actually heard, and based on Todd's slides this morning, if 10% of what's forecasted come to fruition, a lot of us in this room will be involved in those type of projects in short future. The question is, and they actually have validated that traditional ways of looking at it from a stage gate perspective, or actually buying everything in the front so that they can actually build up WIP or get progress is not going to actually suffice for the delivery of these projects. So one thing that I would recommend is continuously actually, you can talk to these gentlemen down here, but also continue to actually learn more about how do we actually deliver projects on time, on budget, with less cash tied up, so that you can actually become more commercially viable as projects mature and scale. Okay? Please join us in thanking these panelists.
Thank you, Keith.